I spend way more on gardening than I really should, and I'm always looking for ways to cut costs. You're probably the same. Hi, I'm GardenerScott, and I discuss everything gardening so that you can become a better gardener. Today, let me share with you some ideas of how to save money in the garden. Gardening can be expensive, and when you're building a new garden like I am and adding new beds all the time, or if you have a garden and you're expanding and adding growing space, it just seems like the money continues to flow. But it doesn't have to be that way. So here are 7 tips for saving money. Some in the short term, some in the long term, but all will definitely help your budget. I love raised beds. They're my preferred method of gardening because of the many benefits that I find when I grow in a raised bed. But you don't have to build a steel bed or a wooden bed or a concrete block bed and shell out the money. Instead, you can make a raised bed and not spend anything. This is my newest growing area. This is a raised bed. It sits about 8 to 10 inches above the soil surface. I took some of my native soil and I amended it with leaves and grass and my own homemade compost. I mounded it and then I planted in it. I've got some melons, I've got some beans that are popping up, lots of tomatoes. Many plants in this space, and I didn't spend anything to make a raised bed and get all of those wonderful benefits. And I'll use that same basic idea to expand my growing areas. Even if you go to the expense and the effort to build some nice wooden raised beds, you don't have to limit your growing within that space. Think outside the box, literally. And so that's what I'm doing here. I've mounded up some soil. I'm using the raised beds as the backdrop, but I have an herb garden here with a nice edging on the front that won't cost me anything. I've expanded this entire area, a whole new herb garden for no cost at all. I'm doing a lot of growing in containers this year, especially these grow bags. And I get asked all the time about the soil and what you're supposed to do with it at the end of the season. Well, I say reuse it. You don't have to toss the soil in your containers after the first year. Use it for another year. There might be some settling and there will probably be some nutrient loss, but go ahead and add a little bit more or add some additional fertilizer and you'll be fine for a whole nother year of growing and even a year beyond that. You don't have to toss it. Now, there will be some upfront costs as you buy or make the potting soil that you're putting in your containers. But in those subsequent years, well, there's very little, if any, cost at all because you can reuse what you have. Along those same lines of reusing what you already have is to take what might normally be yard waste and use it in the garden. You may have noticed that the sides of this raised bed is a bunch of branches from trees that I have in my yard. Instead of buying the sides like I have over there, I'm using these branches as the sides of this raised bed. I also use a lot of the branches as the edging on some of my beds. I just cut them into short sizes, bury them vertically, and I think it makes for a nice decorative way to accent your garden beds. If you saw my video on how I made this fountain, you know I did the same thing here. I took rocks and branches that I already had in my yard and used them to accent this space. Now, I did buy the tub and didn't spend much at all on this little solar fountain, but the rest cost nothing. The next tip is to make your own fertilizer. This is comfrey, and I have 4 of these growing in my landscape. I'll be adding more over time. I take the leaves, I steep them, and make a tea that is very nutrient rich. And I'll use the comfrey tea as a fertilizer on my plants. You can check out the video on how I do that. If you're in the habit of buying compost tea, well, cut out the middleman and make your own compost. Steep it as well, and you've got compost tea. I prefer to use my compost as a soil amendment, but if you like compost tea, you don't need to buy it. Set up some bins, make your own compost, make your own tea, and you've got free fertilizer. And you can do the same thing with worm tea. I have some worm bins set up in my basement grow area just for harvesting worm castings to mix into potting soil or to make worm tea. Loaded with nutrients, it doesn't cost a dime either. A great way to save money year after year is to grow edible perennials. Plants like horseradish and strawberries, and especially asparagus and rhubarb and mint. These are plants that are going to come back every single year. And after you put them in, there's no additional expense. They just keep growing and you keep harvesting. Plant fruit trees. They're extremely affordable if you buy them small and bare root. And you have to have some patience to wait a few years for them to grow. But once they start producing fruit, they'll do it every single year. And every year gets even better. The first year's harvest will more than pay for the cost of the initial tree. Grow fruit bushes and canes, like raspberries I have back there and the currants I have right here. They'll also start producing after just a year or two and continue for decades. Some of the fruit could be quite expensive if you buy it in the store, but if you grow it yourself, it costs nothing, and it definitely tastes better than anything you can buy. Another great way to save money is to propagate perennial plants. About 20 years ago, I bought some strawberry plants, and every year I pot up the runners, and I expand strawberries into other areas of my garden, even moving them to new houses. The strawberry plants in this bed are the descendants of those original plants 20 years ago. And I've had a lot of strawberries over the year at zero cost. And it's not just the fruiting plants, it's all the other perennials in your yard. This horseradish came from root cuttings of another horseradish plant in another garden. This mint is transplanted from my brother and sister-in-law's garden. I put these daylily plants in after I divided a bigger daylily. These ornamental grasses, this lamb's ear, and the comfrey all came from plants that I divided. I have almost 24 lavender plants growing under lights right now. I started them from seed, and I'll put them in the garden next year, saving myself hundreds of dollars. I have 3 yew plants that I started from cuttings, and I've got cuttings of elderberry that are starting to root. Most of the plants that I'm growing in my landscape didn't cost me anything because I propagated them myself. Within the vegetable garden, I'm practicing a different type of method to get more bang for the buck and save a little money. And that's high density planting. If you have a limited space, you can actually grow more than you might think. And so by cramming as many plants into that small space, I'm producing a lot more than, say, if I followed the directions on a seed packet. One of the most common high-density planting methods is square foot gardening, like all of these beets and this kale and rows of radishes. And when you get really good at high-density planting, you'll realize that you can actually grow more in a diamond pattern than in that square foot gardening method. And every extra plant you can grow means you have more harvest. And with the additional harvest, that means that's less that you have to buy at the store. The result is cost savings. Now, I'll put links to a lot of the information that I've referenced in the description below. And if you want to continue on the journey of becoming a better gardener, well, then consider subscribing to the GardenerScott channel if you haven't already done so. And be sure to click on the bell so you're notified when all of these videos are coming out every week and when the live stream happens on Monday. I'm GardenerScott. Enjoy gardening.